In this episode of Coffee with Closers, I'm sitting down with Steve Richett, the co-founder and CEO of ExecVision and Vorsight. During our conversation, Steve shared some of the lessons he learned building a high-performance company. So stay tuned for this episode of Coffee with Closers.
Thanks for joining us for this episode of Coffee with Closers, where business leaders share insights on how to build businesses from the ground up and best practices for innovating in their industry.
Hey Steve, I'm super excited to have you join me for this episode of Coffee with Closers.
How you doing, Samuel? Good to be here too. Thanks.
Most certainly. Hey Steve, I know you've been in this industry for quite some time. You've accomplished a lot. You're an entrepreneur, a serial entrepreneur, built a couple of businesses, a technology company, a service company. You also are a speaker, a sales consultant, doing a whole lot of stuff in your career. Of all the things you've accomplished, which one would you say you're most proud of?
Yeah, good question. So I'll tell you what, it's when you have the salesperson, the sales manager, the sales leader, maybe even the CEO that comes to you 6 months, 2 years, sometimes 10 years down the road and says, hey, Steve, you might not know this, but you've been really impactful on my career. And I was able to get promoted. I was able to start a business. I was able to do whatever. And I owe some of that to you. Like, to me, that's success, you know?
Mm-hmm. And obviously, you know, you're still going at it and you're continuing to do a lot of these things that we're talking about in terms of building companies and growing and speaking. What is that why, would you say it's kind of that drives you the most?
The obvious personal why is I still don't have the kids' college paid for and the mortgage on the house paid down. Anybody who's telling you otherwise is lying, unless they did. Now that's, it's kind of a different answer because, you get the entrepreneurs that get, the old adage, there's like braces money as in like braces for the kids' teeth, and my oldest daughter just got them. And then there's people who have an exit where it's, car money, then house money, and then FU money. Obviously I haven't had the latter, but I think it would change then a little bit. But really, I think that the thing that's more important is like, because Daniel Pink talks about, you got to be motivated by what you're doing day in and day out. The work itself is motivating. I love what I do. I know it sounds bizarre, and some people are like, what do you mean? I mean, they think it's so strange. Like, you love working with companies to help them have better phone calls? Like, that seems so weird. You actually enjoy that? I'm like, yeah, I actually do. I really, really, really like it. Did I ever think this was going to be the thing that I would love doing growing up? Heck no. But I just love seeing people have good results when they're, when they have a lot of folks on the phone. It's tough. I mean, you have a lot of people on the phone. You're going to have a lot of inconsistencies in how people do things. You're going to have best practices that probably are known, but yet people don't do them. They don't do them day in and day out. Accountability is always an issue. People are going at 100 different miles an hour in different directions, and being able to bring that alignment to the management team on this is what good looks like, and then being able to get people who can actually see concrete, quantifiable business results because of something that you did with them, that's motivating. So I know it sounds a little cliche, but for me, the motivation is seeing the customers become successful.
Yeah, I mean, that's the number one motivator anyone can ask for. After you've, obviously you started your journey as a sales rep, and then you kind of transitioned into an entrepreneur, and now you've been at it for quite some time. Can you explain a little bit about how that journey started as an entrepreneur?
Yeah, let me go back to the beginning. So I was undergrad finance major, really was supposed to be in investment banking. Couldn't get a job. I went 0 for 22. This is back in 2002, a little bit after September 11/01 is when I graduated. But I can't blame it on that, because so many of my classmates, I went to undergrad at Georgetown in DC. So many of my classmates did get investment banking jobs. I was kind of the only one who didn't. And then I found my way into sales, kind of fell backwards into it. And I loved that. I started to really enjoy it. But in the beginning, I was bad. I was doing very, very poorly. And that's why I started to realize, go sit with the best people, learn what they do differently. And then from there, eventually did love sales, love the testing and the measurement involved with it. That's where we started our services business called Vorsight, which is outsourced appointment setting. And that was in 2005. So I really went from being a salesperson to owning a business. There was no plan. There were no investors, in the beginning. Now there are. There was really nothing other than like, boy, we're really good at getting appointments. For ourselves and previously for other salespeople, like, we should get appointments for other people. And my business partner, David Stillman, sort of convinced me to do that. And once I saw that the checks were big enough in that, I quit my day job and went and did that full time. And from there, parlayed everything else. We sort of had the platform, if you will, then, Sam, to then grow into all the other things that we could do. That's where we went into the sales training business, and then eventually conversation intelligence and technology for sales coaching for exec vision in that category.
It's kind of funny. You and I kind of have the same story. 2001 is when I graduated from college as well. And I had a computer science degree and I was applying everywhere. And this is a time when if you knew how to spell the word HTML, you would get a job. But as soon as that .com boom just came to an end and September 11 happened, everybody kind of put, the hiring on freeze, and I couldn't find a job. Kind of led me to start my own business around the same time as you did. So it's interesting that there's a lot of entrepreneurs came out of that time frame for sure.
Well, knock on wood, we're going to see the same thing happen post pandemic. Although this virus will always be around in some form or fashion. But the one thing I am going to see is there's a lot of consolidation right now. Mm-hmm. And usually in the wake of consolidation, we do see an entrepreneurship boom. So knock on wood, 2021, especially 2022, I got my eyes on that year as being a big boom year.
Mm-hmm. Which is interesting to kind of watch and see how that unfolds. So obviously you spent the entire career between exec vision and foresight, just learning how people buy and sell and service customers. And that's what you have a technology company and a service company just all around that same area of business. What is kind of one thing that surprised you the most from your learning of building those companies?
Great question. The one thing that surprised me the most is how important leadership alignment is to anything and everything. And it's very, very difficult to have a company be successful without leadership alignment. It can be done. There are some companies that are just in their white hot category. They're growing so fast they can't help themselves, even though they're not aligned. But you see that the best businesses, when they have that leadership alignment, it makes an enormous world of difference. So I would point to that one, and I've seen that within my own companies. I've seen that there have been periods within, there have been actually 3 companies. There have been periods where the leadership team has been extremely aligned and we did very well, and there have been periods where we have not been as aligned and we didn't do as well. And I think the alignment, more than it being like a strategic planning exercise, because it's very easy to sit there and come up with your strategic plan. I think it's more of the how is it going to flow in a rhythm on a day in and day out basis. There are a lot of lessons from the book, Mastering the Rockefeller Habits. Have you ever heard of that one?
Yeah.
Samuel?
Yeah, I have.
Yeah. Love that book. And Rockefeller every day, for example, had lunch with his direct reports. Mm-hmm. And even the word company means with bread. So I think there's a lot to be said for that, and making sure that you have everyone in the same boat rowing in the same direction, especially because almost all these companies are virtual now. That makes it even more important. So talk to me a little bit more about that, because this whole concept of having a vision for the company and then really, translating that into the organization and firing everybody up to follow through on it. So how do you see that, especially how do you get that alignment from a leadership standpoint? It's a series of short interactions. You have to have that. You can't have death by meeting right now. That's out. It's dead. Death by meeting is dead. People just won't put up for it, and they just zone out on Zoom. They get zoomed out, is what I call it. I see what happened with my kids. At the end of the day, they're just like, and they, what did they absorb? Who the hell knows? So it's got to be quick. It's got to be frequent. And the meetings have to be structured in such a way that you can have the dialogue you need to have within your leadership team and within your company, and then within each individual function. You go down into a marketing function, you go down to a sales function. Of course, it's going to be the same, but it's going to look a little bit different, and how that works. A little tip for the sales function, because that's obviously where I play. I find that there are some sales organizations where leadership puts up almost like a little bit of a Chinese wall, when they, like, again, the investment banking sense of that between research and investment banking, a Chinese wall with the reps, where the salespeople are not really included in anything. Now, you can't have everybody involved in every decision. That's insane. But you do want to have sales representation at the table for certain things that you do within the organization, because if not, you might be missing out on what's actually happening on the floor. You know what I mean? Where the people who are talking to the customers day in and day out, you don't have that perspective. And then B, you've got, a lot of opportunity to create a kind of, a chasm between leadership and the people. And then it's going to start to feel like, hey, you're going to tell me to do that. Why? Because you said so. That's not enough good enough reason for me. If you even have a couple of delegates from the sales team involved in some of the key meetings that happen along the way, then people will feel like they own it. And when people own a decision or they own a process, they do way more, kind of emotionally invested to make it happen and make it work than if they have something pushed down on them that they don't agree with. You know what I mean? Yeah, most certainly. And I think especially when you have that top-down, management style, and where
the bottom half doesn't even know what the higher up decided on doing. And then when it just comes out as an order, it's really hard to follow, right? Because then you feel like I'm just an order taker. I don't really have much say in what happens within the organization. And I think what you just described is a great way to get that alignment for sure. Especially
go ahead, finish the thought.
Especially when, like you said, we're all working remote, so we don't even have that community anymore. So we have to do an even better job in making sure everybody feels included.
So I'll give a concrete example of what you're saying there with community and keeping people included and all that. For example, one of the things that I see people roll out call coaching programs all the time. What a surprise with our Exec Vision technology. It's sales, conversation intelligence, and coaching software. So we get to see that. The people who don't have the representatives from sales who are involved, almost always the salespeople initially look at the whole initiative as being like a big brother type of a thing, and they more or less reject it. Or they say, well, the things that management thinks are the right things to be doing in calls and the important things to be saying in calls are actually not. That's not what our experience has been at all with the things that work in calls. And when people feel like, management says, and this is a classic one, new sales methodology. Hey, we're going to have, new chief revenue officer comes in. We're going to do a new sales methodology. We're going all in on force management or Sandler or Challenger or whatever. I have an article about this. I talk about sales training methodologies are like world religions. I don't care which one you are, just be really good at it. And you have these strange Frankenstein methodologies that have little parts of all these different ones, but no one's on the same page. So the tribal knowledge is kind of lost. And that's the stuff that's actually worked to get your company to where it is, to get your sales to where they are. And in the meantime, you got someone else coming in and saying, challenger sale, teach, tailor, take control. Well, that is great. That's fantastic. But how do I make that work with that? And oh, by the way, that chief revenue officer is probably out in 18 months or 2 years anyway. Mm-hmm. So if that's the case, there's no consistency, there's no consistent thread. And that's when you get the whole flavor of the week thing. And I think the place where companies, you have to have this right. So Sam, this is like a non-optional. You have to have a common language and framework for describing buying and selling. And I don't care if you're an e-commerce company and you don't have salespeople. I don't care if you have transactional salespeople that sell one or two call close, or if you have people that are selling commercial aircraft at Boeing and it's big, long, complex strategic sales. If you don't have salespeople, sales leaders, the CEO, the CFO, speaking the same language, using the same vocabulary of describing different selling and buying scenarios, you're not going to be optimized. You're not going to sell as much as you could have. You could have sold more. So you got to think of it in terms of like odds and probability.
So which brings me to the question about like the sales process versus the methodology, right? Because like you said, I read the Challenger book and I'm like, man, there's a lot of things in here that I need to apply, because we're oftentimes, we can do all this deep discovery calls, but I can actually lead with insight. I already know what happens in the industry. I don't need to waste their time. I can tell them this is what's actually happening in your industry. But then, like you said, is the flavor of the day really gets to you, and then you're trying to do this, and then somebody else say, oh, have you heard of Sandler? And now you're going after that. But how do you make sure that you have the sales process, then only use the methodology to just really align with that sales process and make sure that you get the best out of the sales methodology, but really follow that process across the whole finish line?
So this is what I see where companies get wrong. Mm-hmm. Companies will go too far in one of two directions. Direction number one is, we hired professional salespeople. These people have all been there, done that before. They know how to sell. Let them do it what they want. Ooh. Now all of a sudden you've got, just chaos. I mean, essentially that's what it's going to come down to, is chaos. Everyone's going to even enter things in the CRM at a different time. They're certainly going to be doing their own selling at a different time. You might have a sales process that has opportunity stages. What are the gates to go from stage 1 to 2 to 3 to 4? Mm-hmm. So essentially, what are the things that are observable buyer behaviors or actions that need to happen you might have that, like, how do I get to stage 2? Well, these 3 things have to happen before you can be in stage 2, aligned with the buyer's journey. Mm-hmm. But if they're all on a different page for the methodology and what they're saying, it's going to be very difficult to do things like forecast. It's going to be very difficult to have any sort of predictability in what the revenue is going to look like and all that. So that's why I go back to, like, you got to get them on the same page. But the other thing that people do that is messed up is they swing the pendulum too far and they become far too prescriptive. I'm like, this is like your script. We don't want the script either, because that's not what it's all about. So I find the happy medium it's like jazz. In jazz, and I don't play jazz, but I've talked to jazz musicians who describe this to me, and it makes sense. There are certain notes you have to hit based on what piece of music you're playing, and then you get to improvise around it. Mm-hmm. I love that, because we know that's sort of like the science versus the art. There is a science to every sales process out there that we know we can prove, beyond a shadow of a doubt, with data from call recordings, using technology like ours to turn call recordings into data, prove if you do these 5 things, your probability of closing the deal is higher. That's science. But then there's art. How you go about hitting those 5 notes is going to be quite different from person to person, manager to manager, even in some cases. So, you give people the ability to be consistent, have accountability around that methodology tied to the sales process, but at the same time, people are going to be themselves.
Yeah, and I think salespeople do need a little bit of structure, because they tend to just go to, play to their own tunes. But I think you do need that structure. But like you said, you got to give them the freedom to kind of play to their strength and do what, jazz musicians do, which is an interesting point. Which brings me to my question about, obviously you built this company, the Vorsight. Yep. Vorsight, actually, where you are booking meetings and helping companies with sales outreach. And we hear a lot about sales 2.0, cold outreach, and sequencing and all those different things. Social selling, which is like one hot topic you hear about. From your experience of helping companies build sales pipeline, what have you seen really work well? Because I know you hear all these different prescribed methods that we should all be using.
This one is so important. It cannot change anymore based on what you sell or who you sell to. It depends on what you sell and who you sell to. So for example, if you're selling a fairly transactional widget and the demand type is another one, and there are 4 demand types. There's same old, which is essentially commodity. There's better mousetrap. So someone already has something, but it's a better way of doing it. There's evangelical. Evangelical is like, whoa, you can do that. I didn't even realize that was possible. And then there's government regulation. Mm-hmm. Depending on which of those 4, your go-to-market approach could be very different. So let me go back to the example of, let's say you're selling something that's fairly transactional and more or less a same old. You're probably not going to cold call your way into that. Mm-hmm. Just realistically, it's just not going to be the best strategy and approach to getting business. You're going to probably want to drive, a market awareness through, and then get marketing to drive demand gen, inbound leads, that kind of thing. Mm-hmm. And then be cognizant or have triggers on when people are going to enter an active buying cycle. Let's say all of a sudden you're in something that's a government regulation. I think about something like restaurants right now with all the things that they're dealing with. Now all of a sudden it's totally different. In the restaurant world, the percentage of people that need to be aware of government regulations for compliance, for safety standards, is like all of them. So rather than there being just at any given time 3% of your market's buying in that market, it could be potentially way higher, because they have to do something. They have to make changes. They don't have a choice. They can't just go along with status quo. So in that case, the sort of strategies and approaches that you would use, like you actually could cold call your way into, depending on what the product offering is, could cold call your way into, because they have to do something differently than they're doing it today. So the go-to-market strategy is so different. You look at something like a Slack. Mm-hmm. As a great example of the freemium model and how you can leverage the freemium model. Then you look at, we talked about sales training houses like the Force Managements of the world. Most of the time, Force Management gets their leads or referrals, but then of course they go and do their own sales, methodology if they're, drinking their own champagne, and sell their goods that way. But that's going to be kind of like a better mousetrap to other methodologies that might exist out there. So it just depends so much. That's what I'm trying to get at here, and people just don't appreciate how much that matters. I mean, look at what Zoom did for online meetings. I mean, we were all using GoToMeeting. Zoom is the ultimate better mousetrap. Even Microsoft, they better mousetrap themselves with Microsoft Teams compared with Skype for Business. Everyone was using Skype for Business and complaining about it all the time. And now they're rolling everybody out to Microsoft Teams because they don't want to lose the business to Zoom. It's all going to look different depending on one of those 4 demand types, what you sell and who you sell to.
So can you expand on that evangelical type? Because I've never heard this method of go-to-market strategy, but I'd love to hear a little bit more about that approach.
Yeah, evangelical. Like I didn't even know that was possible. Mm-hmm. Let me try to think of a good example. I think the first time you use like a Spotify or something like that as a music offering. Now, granted, I guess it's a little bit of a better mousetrap than having a CD book. Like I still have my CD book in my car, But when you start to realize what's possible with that, you feel like, oh, like the clouds have parted. Like I no clue this could even be done. I mean, wow, that's amazing. You're creating that wow, that's amazing sort of experience. Of course, another one that's like that would be like the Bird scooters, although they've kind of had their trouble because people aren't traveling as much anymore. But when they were hot, I mean, you remember what happened. It was like, it went from, I never saw one of those things at all, and all of a sudden I saw them everywhere. And not only that, but I saw like 30 different companies, and I saw Lime, I saw the Uber one, I saw the Jump and the Skip and the blah, blah, blah. There were so many of those things because all of a sudden people realize that, like, wait, I have a need when I didn't realize I had a need. And that's the trick with the evangelical. Evangelical, you're not selling against an established need. Like, I just needed this. You know what I mean? Like when we all started working from home, because people couldn't hear me well enough, and I do a lot of podcasts. So you just got to get a better microphone. I just had to do it. I didn't have a choice. But with those scooters, I would have never even thought about that in a million years until I saw people cruising around. Those things look kind of fun. And then I went and got one, for the first time and said, this is pretty cool. Now I don't have to deal with, if I'm going to go to a place like a Georgetown from where I live, I don't have to deal with parking, which is a pain in the neck in Georgetown. Those kinds of things cross your mind. So, you've got to think about that. And you also got to think again about who you sell to. If you're selling to a C-level executive at a company with 100 million revenue and up, your strategy might be very different. Maybe you're doing very high-end account-based, gift giving with like a Sendoso kind of a thing, to try to generate initial interest and attention. Versus if you're selling, the one that kind of cracks me up is HubSpot. Of course, HubSpot's always taught us the whole time inbound marketing, outbound's dead, inbound marketing. That's all well and good if you're HubSpot and you sell to marketers at really small companies and marketing agencies, because that message is going to resonate, and they're the sort of people who Google for everything. But what most people don't realize, and I know these guys well, I've been in their office a bunch. I read Dan Lyon's book, Disrupted. You walk into HubSpot's office, they've got hundreds of people cold calling at HubSpot. As they go more up market, you have to cold call into that market because it's not just people Googling and finding stuff. So it's a combination. I wish it was so simplistic that we could just brush this broad stroke. Social selling you mentioned. If you're selling insurance, if you're selling wealth management stuff, if you're selling, that kind of thing, real estate agents, that's another good one. You really got to enable social selling at scale, because that's how they get their businesses, mostly through referrals, because it's, it's kind of a commoditized, like, same old kind of a thing. So that's how you get those initial inroads. I mean, realistically, Samuel, if someone called you, cold called you, selling you insurance or a house, you'd be like, but I have a house, you know what I mean? I have a house and I have insurance and I'm good. I'm all, so it just huge differences in which of the potential tactics and approaches you're going to use, which communication channel you're going to use based on what you sell, who you sell to, and those demand types.
So which brings me to another question about the salesperson's function, because I know I hear a lot of people talk about salespeople need to become subject matter expert. They need to be putting out content that shows their knowledge and expertise, providing value to their prospects, do all of that, right? I think that approach may work really well based on what you described as more so on the evangelical type, right? Where you kind of need to teach people, hey, this is a possibility. You never even thought about it, but this is how you can do it. And is that kind of true? I'm gonna
call BS on that.
Okay.
For the average sales rep selling software, that's not true. And look, I know there are stories like Morgan Ingram and people like that who have kind of, broken out of being an SDR, and he created the SDR Chronicles, and now he works with John Barrows and has a business. There will be some exceptions, but by and large, the most successful salespeople I see in the software industry are not thought leaders, subject matter experts. They are not blogging. They are not doing videos on a regular basis. Do you need somebody like that in your company? Yeah, probably. Not definitely, but there's a good place for that right now. Absolutely. Do you need subject matter expertise that you don't just broadcast out there publicly? Oh, heck yeah. You need to understand your customer status quo. You need to understand what solutions they might use right now. You need to understand how yours is better, different, complementary, supplementary, why it should be a pure play alternative, why you should either compete heads up or you should try to coexist or whatever. You need to know all those things and be a little bit of a subject matter expert. I've seen that the best salespeople now, especially in technology, tend to act a little bit more like their own sales engineers, and that's changed. They can have these deeper technical conversations. They can have deeper conversations on use cases. They know the customer stories. That's different than it was before. But that average salesperson doesn't need to be out there doing all those things I described before. Now, let me give you another one entirely different. If you're a sales consultant, and I know a lot of them, I'm kind of a magnet for sales consultants in some way, or people who are like, I'm sick of corporate America, Steve, help me. What would you do? For them, you better be out there blogging and doing videos and creating a community and capturing email addresses and doing an email newsletter and speaking on every podcast and everything you get invited to and all that kind of stuff. You better believe it. Mm-hmm. But I mean, realistically, the average salesperson doing that's going to be time away from selling, which is what they're supposed to be doing. And the reality is that even if they attract someone to them because they're all online and everything, it's probably going to be someone who's not even in their territory. So it makes absolutely no sense. So don't get me wrong. I mean, it depends. HubSpot's famous for this. HubSpot is famous for having salespeople spend, it's like an hour or two a week, like essentially blogging. Like the expectation is like everyone does one content piece per week or something like that. I love that. That's great because for what they're doing, it makes a ton of sense. And if you're a company that's like, we need to drive inbound, we need to have a lot of content out there, salespeople can certainly be a source of that to an extent. I think one every 2 weeks is about right. If we start asking them to do it once a week or more frequently, A, the content's going to stink probably because they just don't have enough to write about or video about, whatever. And then B, it's going to take them away from selling. So yeah. I would call a BS on that pretty hard. But again, like you were saying a little while ago, we're talking about like the wealth managers or the real estate agents, people like that. Then certainly that's going to matter because credibility for that type of an accountant, that's another great one, CPAs, credibility for that, lawyers, that kind of stuff matters. So for something like that, the answer is yes. Should he do the local TV news interview? Heck yeah. But for the average salesperson, not just in software, really in any industry, the answer is no.
So which brings me to another question about this divide and conquer model, which is the SDR plus AE, right? Yeah. And a lot of organizations, especially in the tech space, that works really well. And they're the ones who have kind of perfected that model. But what about really high touch, where they may not be doing a lot of deals, but they just need, a very strong pipeline? Would you advise against having that SDR in those scenarios where the AE is actually the prospector and actually building that relationship?
Great question. It depends on two variables. Actually a few variables. First variable is how busy is the sales rep, which is probably the most important. And if the sales rep is just busy enough that they have 4 days a week worth of stuff to do, but not 5, should they spend a day equivalent, 8 hours of their week doing that? Yes. The answer is yes. Second thing is how big are the deals? Because if they're in a fairly transactional environment, let's say it's like 25 to 50K or 25 to 75K average contract value, you're probably going to have so many deals you're working at any given time that the salesperson, as much as we, prod them and, kind of force them or try to put a carrot in front of them, prospect, you'll get this award, whatever, they're not going to do it. So the deal sizes need to be big enough. And then I think finally, the biggest part of it is how good they are or willing they are to do it. If they're willing to do it and they're willing to learn, but they are not doing it, we can change that. Because maybe they're not skilled enough or they're rusty. We can help with a prospecting training or something like that. But if they're not willing to do it, again, it doesn't really matter what you do or say. They will always come back to say, we need more SDRs, we need more BDRs, we need more marketing leads, and that's just going to be the way it's going to be. So that's one of those ones where you really do have to feel it out and listen and understand what's going on in your sales ranks.
Yeah, the reason I asked is especially with those big ticket, very long sales cycle where if the AE was not involved very early on, you may never even uncover that opportunity and you may just never even, win that deal. Whereas an SDR who's super junior, he doesn't have the business acumen to be able to ask the right questions or even to be able to go find the right prospect to talk to. That's where I thought, would it always make sense to have this SDR plus AE model or, if it's just straightforward and AE?
No, but it goes back to bandwidth, Samuel. What we were just saying is going to go because in that scenario that you just described, what happens? So let's say there's an inbound lead and the inbound lead is a target right in the middle of the ideal client profile, the ICP of your ICP. And you have a rule that says if a lead like this happens, send it right to the enterprise account executive. Do not go to the SDR, go right over here. You know what happens if that enterprise account executive is too busy? You know what happens? Nothing. They don't call. They don't email. They do nothing. And the other rule that we've got to abide by here is an inbound lead like that, you need to get back to that within 1 hour. So there was old research from InsideSales.com. They're now called Xant that said 5 minutes. They were doing it with a lot of B2C companies too. We have since kind of debunked that in the B2B world that it's partially accurate, but partially not. More recently, we've seen 30 minutes to an hour, anything within that time frame, but earlier is better. sooner is better. So if you're the sort of company that drives a good amount of inbound leads, and those inbound leads need to be followed up on fast, and your account executives are too busy to do it, because if you don't follow up fast, they're going to go somewhere else, then you should have more SDRs. They're right. But if it's not the kind of thing that happens like that, where there's not that much time sensitivity for the purchase and the AEs have enough time, route them right to the AEs, because you're right. Have the consultative dialogue right out of the gate.
An interesting thing that we've noticed with our inbound leads, I know whatever that study that said you got to call them within the first 5 minutes. We actually seen better luck with LinkedIn, just connecting with that person on LinkedIn and saying, I just noticed you reached out, and then having that conversation start on LinkedIn, because we've never seen them actually pick up the phone. Even though they give the phone number, they don't pick up, because they've submitted like 5 form fills on 5 different websites, and they're getting like inundated with so many inbound phone calls. So they just ignore those calls.
I'll give a tip out there for the salespeople listening to this, and this is tested and proven. One of the steps of your cadence, sequence, whatever term you use, plan. We use Sales View, we use Dial Source, Sales Loft, Outreach, those things. You want to have it set up so that you connect on LinkedIn as one of the steps, but don't ask for anything. That's the key. So when you connect on LinkedIn, don't ask for anything. Actually say something about the prospect, something about them as a person, or something about their company. And what that does is it flips on their attention, and they'll accept. Once they accept, you can send them a direct message on LinkedIn, and you can do it for free. Direct messages on LinkedIn, the response rates and positive response rates are significantly higher than InMail if you don't have a brand. So it's one thing that LinkedIn doesn't love if you're running around talking about, but it's true. InMails are when you're sending a message to someone you're not connected with. So we do not have a direct connection. InMails, I've talked to enough companies I can say this and feel really solid that it's research and data and evidence-based, is really effective if you have a brand. Mm-hmm. So companies that have a good brand, LinkedIn will always talk about how effective they are at sending InMails. Well, no shit, because they're LinkedIn and everybody knows who they are, right? And they know they're sending InMails. Mm-hmm. Versus companies that don't have as big of a brand established, like ExecVision. When we tested it, we just did this not long ago. We sent out, I think it was 500 InMails. I think we got 1 positive response. Mm-hmm. 500 emails with the same content, and we were more in the 50 positive mm-hmm. responses. So it was a completely different animal. But when you connect with the person on LinkedIn and send a direct message, it's a different story. And that's a little bit of a Gary Vaynerchuk jab hook kind of a play, where what you're saying is, look, connect. Then step 2 is share some content, share some information about a topic or a trend or something that's relevant to that prospect. And then step 3 is ask for whatever it is you're asking for. You're going to have a higher yield if you do that for most markets. I'll give you one where you don't. One of our customers sells to IT, and they tested that, and it actually was a lower yield. So it did not do as well. But for other markets, and depending on who you're selling to, it'll be much better.
Most certainly. It's almost like what you just said. InMail, LinkedIn claims InMail works really well. It's almost like HubSpot saying inbound works really well, right? Because I think they're a content machine. They produce a ton of content, and anything to do with inbound marketing, they rank for it. So obviously they're driving a ton of demand, which often turns into sales opportunities and deals for them. So yeah, I think. And
I'm not poo-pooing them. Let me just be very clear. There are, depending on what you sell and who you sell to, I keep going back to that. There are plenty of companies with that combination where a pure InMail strategy is a winner, and you want to go all in on that. You know what I mean? That makes a lot more sense. And then there are plenty of companies where a strategy of going 100% inbound marketing makes a ton of sense. Like if you're a marketing agency, for example, it makes a ton of sense because you're going to be driving people to you who are already kind of thinking about HubSpot if you're a HubSpot marketing agent. So it just depends. It depends on the persona of the individual that you're dealing with. They're all going to act very differently, and they're going to have different communication channels that they live by. That's where their tribes might be, right?
Mm-hmm. So one other question that I have, which is also around kind of the personality and the sales reps. Obviously, you've spent your entire life just dealing and interacting with the salespeople and training them. What have you seen the biggest obstacle for them in terms of reaching success in their own personal sales
It is
journey?
all about the reinforcement to mastery. What I find is that the vast majority of money that's spent on sales training ends up being, sadly, a waste of money. Mm-hmm. Because people will be put through a 1.5 day, 2-day course. Now, at least in the pandemic world, it's broken down to 2-hour sessions. But unless you have, unless you're going to do that and use it day in, day out. I mean, I'm watching my son right now, he's 7, starting to learn to shoot a free throw, a foul shot. And we did 120 this weekend. If I do 120 this weekend and then we do nothing for a month, it's not going to help. It's not going to make a difference. But it's the fact that I'm going to do 120 with him either every day or every other day for a long period of time. That's what makes all the difference. So you just got to use the stuff. You got to use the vocabulary, which we talked about before. Everyone's got to be using the same term. I'll give you an example of what I'm talking about. Some people talk about discovery. I mean, that's kind of a common word, or qualification. But what does that really mean? In company A, qualification means these things. In company B, qualification means something entirely different. I've seen some people where they say qualification doesn't happen until stage 3, but what they mean is that they're qualifying based on like the underlying technology systems and stuff like that you can only learn about when you're really late in the sales process. Or another example of one is like a specific term, like we use critical business issues, or CBIs. Our chief revenue officer. The term CBIs outside of our company, unless they're like hardcore old school solution selling people, doesn't mean squat. They don't know what that means. You know what I mean? Or maybe they learned it at one point. It kind of one ear, one out the other, because when you sleep, you forget everything. So you've got to have everyone on the same page. At our company, it's almost like a cult of CBIs. We know exactly what it means. We know what is a CBI. We know it's not a CBI. We know how to document our sales process. And now everyone is singing off the same sheet of music. And in Exec Vision, we've got all of our keyword trackers for CBIs. So we know whether or not the CBIs were being used in the calls, where they're not being used. And boom, we have consistency. Hooray. We have a way of holding people accountable.
So talk to me a little bit about building a sales team, especially in a smaller organization, because big companies have the luxury of having all these tiers of possible progression path. Hey, you started as a ZI, you become AE, now you're a sales director, whatever, all those different progression, even become a CRO sometime in the future. But a smaller organization don't have that luxury, right? So how do you build a very high performing sales team in a much smaller organization where you may not have such levels of organization?
You'll be surprised at my answer. I would actually say step 1 is get virtual assistants. Mm-hmm. The first area that ends up being the biggest time suck for most companies is just getting contact information for people who are the right persona within companies that are good fit accounts. So get virtual assistants in places like the Philippines or India or wherever it might be. It could be onshore too. Doesn't matter. It could be in Latin America. I don't care. But people who really, you teach them about your business, they understand and they're able to consistently identify those right targets. And then either you market to them or not. So I'd say that's the first thing. The second thing is you have to reverse engineer it, a la Good to Great, the wonderful book Good to Great, where you say Jim Collins, the right butts in the right seats. So what is the right seat? Meaning, how do we define the job? Define the job first. Your job definition, or your job profile. I learned this from a consultant friend of mine, Chris DeCenzo. I worked for him for a while. Your job profile is not your publicly facing job description. That's not a job rec. A job profile is like, in this job, here is how you're measured, and here's an expected allocation of time. So measurement of success, expected allocation of time, and based on those things, then you say, who's the ideal person for that type of a role, whatever that role might be. If it's a big, account management job, and you're interviewing a bunch of people that have been doing a lot of hunting in, like, let's say, selling advertising sales, right? They work for like a digital media company doing advertising sales. They're probably not going to be a good fit for someone to do account management for a big strategic complex sale at a software company, because their whole rhythm was different. Their whole rhythm was built on like high volume outbound. An account manager, it's all about working the relationships you have, developing a few extra relationships you have, and then being very, very detail oriented and documenting everything that happens along the way and knowing the right next move based on where the customer is and what's going on within the customer account. Completely different kinds of people are going to be good at those types of sales jobs. So you got to document the role and understand the right seat on the bus, then you fill it with the right type of person. And there was a wonderful book called Derek Gatehouse called The Perfect Salesforce, where he spends a lot of time talking about this. And this is the reason why you might see someone who is like an awesome salesperson at Oracle, and then they go work at a startup and they tank. And this is the reason why. I talk a lot about that with Mark Roberge, the former chief revenue officer of HubSpot, about this topic. He's very passionate about this topic. I would actually rather get a failed entrepreneur to be the first sales leader, and so would he, because that's someone who's had to just scrounge, and the figured out factor's high, and they've suffered before, and they understand what it means to tact along the way, versus the person who worked at Oracle. Not everyone, but they're kind of like living in the Borg. There's not a whole lot of variability. Your job all of a sudden turns into a box that's like yay big, instead of it being expansive where like anything is possible. So, you got to be real careful to answer your question on who you put in what role and if that's all designed correctly. And look, sometimes there's not a career path. Sometimes there's not a career path. In some cases, you're going to hire an SDR and tell that SDR right off the bat, probably 18 months or 2 years. You might even want to have an outplacement to help them get their next job. Or other places in the industry when it's time for them to close deals and sell, because they can't make the jump from an SDR down here to being a strategic account executive up here. It's just too big, and you don't have that intermediate point on the ladder.
Yeah, I think you mentioned the story. Mark Roberge, he was on a prior episode with me, and he did tell me, I think he hired somebody from some big enterprise company when HubSpot was in its early stages. But I think he made that mistake and realized, well, wow, what the person that worked at a very big company with a big brand presence, this guy was a killer, but then HubSpot was a startup and he couldn't make anything move. So which is usually the case.
And let's not knock those other, people who work at like IBM or Oracle or something are probably like, screw you guys. No, the inverse is also true. So I've seen people who, have been startup hustlers that go into a place like an Oracle and they fail out horribly, and they were excellent at startups because they're not good at dealing with the structure. They're not good at dealing with the policy and the procedure and working within and, coloring within the lines instead of coloring outside lines. Their brains just don't work that way. So they end up, even though they're great salespeople, dying. So it just depends. Again, it's all about that fit that I said before. It depends on so many different factors. And if you kind of look at something logically from the outside in, you go, why would they hire that person? Like, it just doesn't fit. It doesn't make any sense.
So I have a couple of rapid fire kind of questions just to get your input on some of these items, especially from a mindset. What do you do for you to get to that successful mindset?
I go running every morning. If I didn't, I would go crazy.
What are you doing for personal development? Not
as much as I should anymore. I did a lot for a long time, but I've read hundreds of books. But if you don't have a sales book or a business book or a leadership book in your hands at all time, you're making a mistake. I used to read on flights, but that's obviously going the way of the dodo. But I need to start doing that again. I got to get back on the learning curve. My next up is Chet Holmes' Ultimate Sales Machine, which, believe it or not, I've never read.
It's an old book.
I quote it all the time. I know, yeah.
Yeah, I think some of the old tactics in there that actually is what actually people are starting to implement. He's the guy that would send, pen with the notes on it and those kind of stuff. That book, I read it like ages past. I just heard that he passed away like 7 years ago. They also have a sales methodology and training from what I heard. Leadership versus management, which function do you mostly kind of automatically fall into?
Without question, leadership. I'm not a good sales manager. My sales people, I got 3 of them that report to me, will tell you that, because sales management requires kind of this like repetition. It's like Groundhog Day, and my mind just doesn't work that way. I'm too damn ADD, and it's going bing, 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 bing all over the place. And the best sales managers are just relentlessly obsessed about like a few things, and they continually inspect those few things again and again. They continually coach those few things again and again. I wish I was better at that, actually, ironically.
What do you do specifically in your organization to make sure that your team understand your vision for the company?
Share calls with them when I'm articulating the vision, and share, which is a part of what our software does, allows you to share snippets of calls where you hear the customer responding and reacting to the articulated vision. There's nothing like hearing it from that customer or that prospect.
What do you do to make sure that you have a high performance culture within your company?
I'll answer it by saying this: selling naked. What I mean by that is a guy named Dave Brown who said that term at an inside sales that I went to. And what that means is every metric is public for everyone to see all the time.
What's your one biggest productivity hack?
Well, I said one of them before, which is the virtual assistants. That's a really, really good one. My second is turn off notifications for email and Slack. Especially if you're a leader, you can kind of get away with this. If you're not a leader, it's a little bit more tough. But then just check those at certain times of the day, because otherwise the distraction factor is way too high.
Knowing what you know today, how would you build your business differently? What would you do differently in terms of building a company?
Yeah, it's a great question. I would have started with, because I was a professional services guy that got into tech, I would have started with a technical founder right out of the gate. And I think I would have, it would have been a little bit less heartache if I had done that earlier on. Have a non-technical founder and a technical founder. So like a business, not so much a business founder, but like a sales founder. You need someone who can sell. And speaking of HubSpot, they talk about that. You need someone who can sell, but then you need someone who's just obsessed with the product and get into the code.
Yeah, I think HubSpot has that, especially between the CEO and CTO of Dharmesha. And same thing with SalesLoft too. I think Kyle is a sales guy, but I think his co-founder was the tech guy. That's definitely true.
Rob Foreman. Rob Foreman is one of the most incredible technical founders. Brilliant.
Awesome. Well, Steve, I really enjoyed our conversation today. Thank you again for sharing some of your wisdom and knowledge. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Samuel. Appreciate being here.
This episode of Coffee with Closers is brought to you by One IMS, a leading digital marketing agency helping businesses win new customers. To request a free marketing ROI audit, please visit oneims.com. If you enjoyed this video, please share it. To make sure you never miss an episode, please subscribe.